August 13th, 2018. A quiet neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado wakes up to something that doesn't fit. Police lights, a worried friend, and a husband standing barefoot in his driveway, telling reporters he just wants his family back. He speaks softly. He looks controlled, almost too controlled. That morning, Chris Watts appeared on local news asking for the safe return of his pregnant wife, Shanann, and their 2 daughters. There were no visible tears, no frantic movements, just a calm voice repeating that he didn't know where they were, and that calmness would become one of the most analyzed behaviors in modern true crime history, because what people didn't know yet was that the story was already over. Chris Watts did not look like the kind of man people fear. He was quiet, reserved, physically unassuming, no criminal record, no documented history of violence. He worked as an oil field operator. He showed up on time. He followed routines. To neighbors, he was polite. To acquaintances, he was almost forgettable. And sometimes, that is what makes cases like this so disturbing. There was no obvious warning sign, at least not on the surface. Shanann was active on social media. She posted videos of family trips, birthday parties, dancing in the living room. From the outside, the Watts family looked stable. But stability on camera does not always mean stability in reality. Behind the curated posts, financial strain had been building. Debt, a previous bankruptcy, pressure to maintain a certain image. At the same time, Chris began withdrawing. Emotionally, friends later described subtle changes. Less engagement, less warmth, less presence. Psychologically, emotional withdrawal is not explosive. It is quiet. It happens in small increments. Conversations become shorter. Affection decreases. Eye contact fades. Resentment grows internally rather than being expressed. And resentment that remains unspoken does not disappear. It accumulates. In 2018, Chris started an affair with a coworker. For the first time in years, he felt excitement that wasn't tied to responsibility. He felt seen, desired, free. Text messages later revealed how detached he had become from his family life. He spoke about starting over, about a future without financial stress, about imagining a new beginning. This is where the psychological fracture becomes visible. Instead of confronting problems directly, he began mentally separating himself from them. There was the life at home, and then there was the imagined life. 2 identities running in parallel. Maintaining dual identities requires compartmentalization. It requires emotional numbing, and eventually, it creates a breaking point. On the early morning of August 13th, Shanann returned from a business trip around 2 a.m. Security footage captured her entering the house. She appeared tired, normal, unaware that this would be her last night alive. Later that morning, Chris loaded items into his truck before sunrise. He drove to a remote oil site where he worked. He texted coworkers casually. He contacted a realtor. He communicated with his girlfriend as if nothing unusual had happened. There was no digital panic, no emergency calls, no search efforts initiated by him. When Shanann's friend couldn't reach her later that morning, she became concerned. Repeated calls went unanswered. Appointments were missed. Eventually, she contacted police. An officer arrived at the Watts home that afternoon. Body camera footage captured the interaction. Chris allowed entry. He explained that Shanann had taken the girls to a friend's house, but as the officer walked through the house, subtle details began to stand out. Purse left behind, medication still inside, car still in the garage. The explanation did not align with the physical evidence. While the officer searched, Chris displayed signs of internal stress. He swayed slightly. He clasped his hands. His speech was flat and oddly rehearsed. Not dramatic, not frantic, just emotionally muted. This emotional flatness became central to public reaction. Because when a parent believes their children are missing, emotional response is usually intense. Panic is common. Desperation is visible. But Chris remained controlled. Later that day, a neighbor invited police to review surveillance footage. Chris stood inside the neighbor's house as officers watched him on screen loading his truck. Early that morning, in that moment, something shifted. His arms folded tightly across his chest. His posture stiffened. He avoided eye contact with the screen. It was subtle, but noticeable. Investigators began transitioning the case from missing persons to potential homicide. Interrogation followed. Detectives did not begin with accusations. They built rapport. They asked open-ended questions. They allowed silence to linger. Chris maintained his innocence. He insisted he had no idea where his family was. But deception requires cognitive effort. It demands consistency. It demands emotional regulation. As hours passed, inconsistencies surfaced. Details shifted slightly. Timelines blurred. Eventually, investigators introduced a polygraph examination. Before the test, the examiner explained how physiological responses can indicate deception. Chris agreed. When the results came back, The examiner stated clearly that the results indicated deception. In that moment, his composure weakened, his breathing deepened, his shoulders dropped. This is often described as a psychological collapse point, when maintaining the constructed narrative becomes too exhausting. Shortly after, he offered a partial confession. He suggested that Shanann had harmed the children and that he reacted in anger. This narrative attempt is significant. It reframed him as reactive rather than initiating. It attempted to preserve some moral distance, but investigators pressed further, and eventually, he admitted responsibility. The bodies were later recovered at the oil site where he had worked that morning. The choice of location was not random. It was familiar, remote, accessible to him. That detail reflects forethought, not impulse, which challenges the idea of a spontaneous emotional explosion. Instead, it suggests premeditation. Psychologists later examined themes within the case: conflict avoidance, narcissistic traits, image management, emotional detachment. Chris Watts did not appear outwardly aggressive, but aggression does not always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like elimination of obstacles. Instead of confronting financial strain, divorce, and social consequences, he chose a permanent solution, one that destroyed everything. During sentencing, family members addressed him directly. They spoke with grief, with disbelief. He pleaded guilty and received multiple life sentences without parole. There was no full trial, no extended courtroom drama, just finality. But the case continues to disturb people years later, because it disrupts a comforting belief, the belief that dangerous individuals always look dangerous. In reality, many violent crimes are committed by individuals who appear ordinary. The Watts case also highlights the power of modern evidence. Text messages, GPS data, security cameras, digital footprints create timelines that emotions cannot erase. Investigators were able to reconstruct behavior minute by minute, and that reconstruction exposed the truth. In later prison interviews, Chris attempted to adjust aspects of his story, adding new emotional explanations, reframing motives, but the core facts remained unchanged. This was not a chaotic crime fueled by visible fury. It was a quiet unraveling, a slow, emotional detachment that culminated in irreversible action. Perhaps the most unsettling image remains that driveway interview. A husband speaking softly into cameras, asking for help, appearing composed, because sometimes the absence of visible emotion is more alarming than visible distress. The story of Chris Watts is not just about crime. It is about avoidance. It is about identity fracture. It is about what happens when resentment grows unchecked inside someone who refuses to confront it. Suppressed conflict does not disappear. Fantasy does not replace reality. And silence is not the same as peace. In Frederick, the neighborhood eventually returned to normal rhythms. New families moved in. Life continued. But the case remains a reminder. Ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary breakdowns. And sometimes, the most dangerous collapse is the one no one sees coming.